This one policy, I should say, is the policy that would break Putin. If Putin couldn't sell his oil, he would no longer be able to afford his war, and he would have to come to the negotiating table. So this is the policy that would work. As you've pointed out, Trump has been inconsistent in this policy.
So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
I want to get your reaction to what happened last Friday, which is, of course, Hungary's PM, Viktor Orbán. He traveled to D.C. where he met with Donald Trump. There were a few big takeaways, one of which was Trump said that there was a very good chance of a future summit with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Hungary committed to purchasing $600 million worth of U.S. liquefied gas. And Trump granted Hungary an exemption from U.S. sanctions on Russian oil imports. So let's start with these exemptions. Trump said that it was very difficult for Hungary to get oil and gas from other areas. They don't have the advantage of having sea. They don't have ports. They have a difficult problem. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, the exemption was only granted for 1 year, so it's not a permanent exemption. Secondly, Hungary does have access to other forms of oil, and in fact, they're trying to get themselves set up to use that. And so the idea that they're totally unable to is not correct. And thirdly, it sends a terrible message if we're trying to isolate Vladimir Putin, we're trying to financially cut him off. How do we insist that the Indians, the Chinese, and the Turks, who buy much more Russian oil than the Hungarians buy, can't buy it if President Trump is granting an exemption to Viktor Orbán? And so it's sort of part of this whole kind of confused foreign policy when it comes to Putin and when it comes to Russia from the Trump administration.
Does it show to you that Donald Trump was never really sure that he was actually going to implement these sanctions on countries outside of course, India for importing Russian oil?
Well, he hasn't implemented the sanctions. If you remember, there was this big summit in Anchorage, Alaska. Leading up to the summit, the condition was that he would impose sanctions on people who bought Russian oil, mainly the Chinese, Indians, and Turks, if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire. No ceasefire was agreed to and no sanctions were imposed. And so the whole idea of this one policy, I should say, is the policy that would break Putin. If Putin couldn't sell his oil, he would no longer be able to afford his war, and he would have to come to the negotiating table. So this is the policy that would work. As you've pointed out, Trump has been inconsistent in this policy. There's a piece of legislation waiting in the wings from his Republican ally, Lindsey Graham, and Senator Dick Blumenthal, which would impose 500% penalties on countries that bought Russian oil. It's been supported by 85 Senate co-sponsors. It would pass in a heartbeat if it was introduced on the Senate floor. The only reason it hasn't been introduced is because Trump has told Lindsey Graham not to introduce it. And all of these things, either Trump actually imposing the sanctions or this sanctions bill from Lindsey Graham would do the trick. But here we are sort of floundering in this sort of sea of compromise right now.
And as you mentioned, this bill from Lindsey Graham, we haven't heard any updates on it in a really long time. Of course, Congress is on recess and there's a government shutdown, so there are things at play. But regardless, it's really kind of fallen by the wayside. But Bill, you and I have spoken at great lengths every time you've come on the show about these sanctions threats against these countries importing Russian oil. Of course, India was hit with this months ago and it hasn't really been used on other countries. So why do you think Donald Trump is so hesitant about not following through with this threat?
Well, I can't really get myself inside the psychology of Donald Trump. I don't think anyone can. This is sort of the crazy man, style of governance. It's impossible to know what he's thinking. He seems to have this. The body language is that he seems to really want to be friends with Putin. He was laying out the red carpet, literally. U.S. soldiers were on their hands and knees on the tarmac below the presidential plane, laying out a red carpet for Vladimir Putin. At the same time, when Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, arrived in Washington, there wasn't even a single U.S. official to meet him. I mean, the body language tells you everything. Now, having said all that, the one thing that has happened, which is very material, is that the U.S. government imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil suppliers in Russia. And those sanctions have had an impact, and they have caused all sorts of trouble for people, including Indian oil refiners and all sorts of other customers, suppliers, and intermediaries in the market.
And we'll get into that impact in a second, Bill. But I want to keep going with this just to finally wrap up this meeting with Orbán. Trump said, as I mentioned at the start, that he still thinks there's a very good chance of a future summit with Putin in Budapest. A bit of a stark contrast to him, of course, a few weeks ago, saying there's really there's no point in doing it because we're not going to get really anything out of it. I don't want to waste my time, pretty much. So, but we're still in the same position as we always have been, in the sense that Russia won't agree to the ceasefire. They won't drop their weapons in where the battle lines are, and they won't make any more concessions, but they will, of course, request for Ukraine to do so. So when Donald Trump says that, it's still on the cards to have this summit, what's the point?
It's just, it's sort of real estate developer talk. I mean, it's, making all sorts of promises that he has no intention of keeping. There's no basis for which any summit is going to take place. A summit requires a compromise from the Russians. They've showed no indication at any point, anywhere in any conversation, that they're ready to compromise. Their position is the same position they've had since the beginning of the war, that they want a total capitulation of Ukraine. That's not changing. And there's not going to be a summit in Budapest. I think we can just cross that off the list. And so whatever Donald Trump is saying, add that to the list of things, of untruths that he's repeated before.
The US and Hungary, they signed this memorandum of understanding on nuclear energy, which is a formal agreement to work together on these nuclear proposals. It's not a law, it's not a treaty. It's more of a promise to cooperate with each other, along with the fact that Orbán announced a nuclear fuel deal with Westinghouse, which means that Hungary will be less reliant on buying its nuclear fuel from Russia. So these two combined, Bill, would this partnership infuriate Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that Vladimir Putin is sort of embattled on all sides. To the extent that that the sanctions have been imposed, it's causing him all sorts of problems in all sorts of different areas. They're having to cannibalize aircraft, one Boeing aircraft, in order to fix another Boeing aircraft. They've run out of they make cars that don't have airbags. There's all, I mean, at every step of the way, the sanctions are causing him all sorts of problems. This is a new set of problems, and when Putin says that sanctions aren't hurting him, that's just bravado and bluster. Sanctions are hurting him very profoundly, and to the extent that this type of action takes away some business from Russia, that hurts him, and that's helpful. And so. But again, it's all very inconsistent. It doesn't follow any clear path. It doesn't seem to follow any strategy, and it just seems to be, Trump will do something and then not do something and then do something and then not do something. But overall, Putin can survive. He can carry on, and that's what we have to stop.
Well, let's get into these impacts from the sanctions. Bill, Lukoil, one of Russia's biggest oil companies, has declared force majeure on Iraq's giant West Kurna 2 oil field, according to 4 sources that have told Reuters. So that is a direct impact from these UK and US announced sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, of course, 2 of Russia's largest oil companies. So Iraq's state oil company also had to suspend crude loadings tied to Lukoil's share, since selling those oil could violate these US sanctions. So are we starting to see the impact of these on Russia's economy?
Well, so this project that you're discussing is a long-term project. It's something that will happen in the future. It's not something which is like, pumping huge amounts of oil. And of course, that hurting Lukoil in that way is helpful in the long term. But what I'm more concerned about is what happens in the short term. And Lukoil and Rosneft have big customers in China, India, and Turkey. And from what I understand, some of the customers, I've read that the customers in India are no longer comfortable buying oil from these two suppliers, and that is helpful. That will cause less revenue to accumulate in Putin's pockets. Basically, the point of these sanctions is that if anyone does business with Lukoil or Rosneft, then they could potentially be in trouble, in financial trouble, with the U.S. Treasury, and nobody wants to be in financial trouble with the U.S. Treasury. And so that is helpful. That's causing some pain. It's not universal pain, and then there are some people who continue to buy the oil. And there was a really dramatic article in the FT over the weekend. It was a profile of some young guy in his 30s who made $250 million personally in the last couple of years, basically coming up with tricks and tools to trick the sanctions regime. And I suspect and I fear that whatever has been done to Lukoil and Rosneft, there will be these characters like this one who was profiled in the FT this weekend, who will try to find ways around it. And so the sanctions program has to be tough. It's got to be complete, and it shouldn't just sanction the Russian oil suppliers. It should also sanction the buyers of Russian oil.
When we start to see more of an impact as time goes on, Bill, what will the knock-on effect be for inside Russia, do you think?
Well, basically, Russia has only one major source of revenue, and that is the sale of oil and the taxes on that oil. And that's the money that supports the Russian war machine. And the Russian war machine is very expensive. It's expensive for them to buy ammunition from North Korea, drones from Iran. It's expensive for them to pay big bonuses to poor people from the provinces to go and basically effectively become cannon fodder in Ukraine. And as that money dries up, they can buy less weapons, they can buy less people to go and kill themselves in Ukraine, and it just makes the whole war effort that much more difficult and painful. And Putin's main approach to this war has just been to completely not blink at the cost of anything, not to blink at the cost of human life, not to blink at the financial cost, at the loss of equipment, and if he doesn't have the money, then he's eventually going to blink. And that's the objective that we should have in the West, is to put him in a position where he just can no longer afford to do this anymore.
There's been so much back and forth in the last few weeks when it comes to nuclear testing between US and Russia. Trump said he wanted to restart testing and be on an equal basis with Russia and China, but then the energy secretary denied that any testing would involve explosives. And then Sergei Lavrov, however, said to the press this week, he said regarding President Vladimir Putin's instructions at the Security Council meeting on November 5th, it has been accepted for implementation and is being worked on. So, I mean, Bill, are these empty threats from the Russians to say that they're about to start nuclear testing?
Well, ever since the war began, any time that the U.S. did anything that was helpful to Ukraine, from supplying tanks to supplying F-16s to supplying long-range missiles, Russia flashed their nuclear card. They said, we're going to do, that this is going to risk nuclear war, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. This is all part of the nuclear saber rattling that Russia does on a regular basis. The reason why Russia has not launched a nuclear war since the beginning of their ill-fated invasion of Ukraine is because a nuclear war leads to mutually assured destruction. That's why there has not been a nuclear war since the Second World War. And those conditions continue to exist, and there's no reason why Vladimir Putin would launch a nuclear war, because that would be complete and absolute suicide if he did that.
There's this video surfacing of an 11-year-old girl talking to Vladimir Putin about her wounded uncle who wasn't being treated in hospital. And she says they're now sending him on a mission. She says that she wants her uncle to be sent to a good hospital. Putin replies saying that they will find him. And this took place as Russia was celebrating Unity Day, Bill. So what's your response to this video going around of the little girl asking if her uncle can actually be treated for the wound he got in the war?
Well, I feel very sorry for the uncle because he'll probably now be rounded up and put in prison for some type of made up offense, and her parents will probably also be arrested. This is what happens in Russia regularly when people bring up the war, when they complain about conditions, when they talk about anything that's not convenient. And so the video all looks very touching. Putin says we'll find the uncle. We know what that means.
I mean, Bill, if Russian troops are injured and they're not being treated and then they're being sent back to the battlefield, what do you think it says about Putin's approach to the war and how Russian troops are being treated? Because we know that they've lost 1 million troops since the war began.
Well, according to Ukrainian estimates, the number is now about 1,150,000 troops have been lost. And Putin just doesn't care that his heart doesn't beat faster. He has no sense of empathy whatsoever. It doesn't bother him in the slightest. And so all he's looking at is raw numbers. How does he get more bodies out there? He doesn't care whether they're good soldiers or bad soldiers. They will send in literally hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers to gain a few meters of territory in some town that they're trying to take over. He just doesn't care.
Bill, just finally, the European Commission has put forward a plan to allow EU governments to access this 185 billion euros out of the 210 million of Russian foreign sovereign assets that have been frozen in Europe since the start of this war. So the US has also publicly backed this support. This would obviously be money that goes straight to Ukraine to help them continue their fight. So a US official said that Washington absolutely supports the steps they're taking to be in position to make use of those assets as a tool. So we know that the EU had already been using the interest made off these frozen Russian assets. But how big of a deal is this to give this money to Ukraine? And does it make a difference to have the US support on this?
Absolutely, it makes a difference. The U.S. needs to operate in parallel with the European Union, with the U.K., with Japan and other countries in effectively confiscating this money. And this money is a game changer. On one hand, we don't want Putin to have any money from the sale of oil. On the other hand, we need Ukraine to have the money to defend themselves. This money would go a long way towards helping Ukraine defend themselves, particularly in the world that we live in right now, where the U.S. has stopped supplying financial military aid to Ukraine, and the European governments are all completely cash strapped. Every government is having a budget crisis right now. And so this money would make the difference between Ukraine being able to stand tall and defend themselves versus Ukraine collapsing. And so it's absolutely essential that Ukraine gets this money.
So Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.